Whether you're new to electronic drums or a seasoned eDrums user, there's some common things that people get wrong when using this instrument. I'm going to show you how to avoid these electronic drum mistakes so that you can have a better eDrum experience. Let's get to it. Hey, welcome to the eDrum Workshop. I'm Luke and I hope you're having a great day. If you want to learn handy tricks or skills to get the best out of your electronic or hybrid drums, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to stay up to date with all of these kinds of videos, along with news, reviews and discussions. A lot of things go into making electronic drums feel natural. With all those variables, it's really easy for something to go wrong. I'm a firm believer that dodgy experiences from badly optimized setups are the leading cause of people thinking that electronic drums are toy-like or inauthentic. So let's get stuck into what these pratfalls are, why they can be a problem, and how you can go about fixing them to have a better experience. The first thing that comes to my mind, and this is usually with beginner users, is using the volume control and the pad sensitivity options interchangeably. I've seen many a post on Facebook where somebody's been finding that one of their pads sounds a bit too weak compared to the others, and then they explain how they've cranked the volume up but it still hasn't helped. And conversely, I've seen people trying to turn down their pad volume to combat things like machine gunning. If you're getting one drum sounding weak compared to the others despite the volume being pretty much the same, this is most likely going to be a trigger settings issue. You'll probably also notice that alongside it sounding quite quiet, it never really feels like it hits that top velocity layer. This is where an increase in pad sensitivity is required. And on the other side of things, if you've set your sensitivity quite high and it sounds like you're getting those hard-hitting samples but they're just quiet, then that's likely to be a volume issue. Understanding the relationship between the trigger settings, what sounds are produced, and the interplay between those settings and the volumes lets you know which avenue you need to go down to tweak. And this is a common problem that I've seen come up for the rim of a pad or the edge of a cymbal pad a lot too. These people might know how to set the overall sensitivity of the pad, and what they might not be aware of is that there's usually a rim gain setting in the pad trigger settings options. This allows you to compensate for the difference between the signal of the rim and the head sensors. So you often see people cranking the rim volume wondering why it still sounds quite quiet, not realizing that all they're doing is boosting the volume of a low velocity rim strike. And all this talk of sensitivity and trigger settings leads me on to the next point. From a lot of videos I've seen of people playing their eDrums, one thing has become very apparent. A very common mistake on eDrums is just bad dynamic settings. I've seen many videos of people visibly playing quite soft, while the snare drum cracks out the hardest hitting sample inside the module, blasting you in the face on every buzz roll. Sure, you might sound like a metal god as you blast around your kit 127 velocity guns blazing, but you're creating a problem for yourself in a bunch of ways if you do this. Sometimes this is simply born out of people not really knowing how it should be. If you're new to drums in general and you've bought an electronic kit to learn on, you might not actually know what level of strike is supposed to produce what sound. And even players who have a lot of acoustic drum experience but either haven't played one for a long time or just prefer the sound of the higher velocity layers can fall into this trap easily too. I know I've done it in the past, and you might wonder why this is even actually an issue. Surely you should put these settings where you want them and just have fun. The main problem with this kind of approach is that even though you might really enjoy feeling like every single hit you do is smiting your drum kit, you're going to run into very inconsistent dynamics if you ever want to transfer back over to an acoustic kit, or even if you just play another electronic kit that's properly optimized. After a long time playing eDrums, your acoustic kits can feel pretty weird anyway. All those tonal inconsistencies compared to those perfect heavily processed samples. Why does the kick drum sound so quiet compared to the snare and cymbals? And this will only be exacerbated by not being able to properly control your own dynamics. You could find that it'll lead to a few different problems. The first of which being that your hits might just be too weak to actually get to the dynamics that the music calls for. If you need a strong backbeat snare but your trigger settings have been doing all the work for you, you might not actually be able to reach for that. And there's the fact that if you're always maxing out your trigger input from every single mid-level and upward stroke, that's a large portion of your dynamic range that you're not actually practicing how to control. Having your triggers set up badly here can make you believe that you're more consistent than you really are. And I think that this variable in particular is one of the reasons why a lot of people advise against using electronic drums to practice, especially when you're new to drums. People wrongly believe that bad video examples or poorly set up store demo units are actually how all electronic drums play. Many of us know that isn't true, but if you've never seen another example, then you might believe it yourself. And I also think this is one of the reasons why some people experience machine gunning with certain modules, even if they shouldn't do if their trigger parameters are set up correctly. And it's not just hitting that top level too quickly that can be a problem. Many people make the mistake of picking the wrong dynamic curve option for their playing style as well, and this can lead to just as problematic results. A lot of people don't actually know what dynamic curve does what. So here's a chart from Roland's manual that explains it all for you. You might have your top end dynamics set up perfectly, but if you're on the wrong dynamic curve option, your lower to mid-level strokes can suffer too, once again leading you to believe that your playing is more controlled and balanced than it really is. So the best way to combat this is to go into your trigger settings and find the sensitivity options. It might also be called gain on certain modules, and use the trigger monitor that most modules have to gauge exactly where you're topping out, making sure that it really is only your top level dynamics that are maxing the meter. Of course, it doesn't have to be physically the hardest hit you could ever achieve. If you're never going to use that musically, then there's no point dialing in for it. But in my experience, you want whatever your standard backbeat level is to be triggering around 75 to 80% of the trigger meter. That way you've always got that final 20% that you can reach for if you need it. And then aim for that all around the kit. Once you've got your top levels set appropriately, you'll need to play around with the different curves to find one that accurately represents what you're doing. This one's a little bit more personal, so it's hard to give specific advice. But the general rule of thumb is that you want to try and get your dynamic range as wide as possible, but still in a way that feels natural. So if your ghost notes are sounding like mid-level hits, try and find a curve that doesn't bottom out too high up. This can be a tricky one, but with enough perseverance you'll find the right balance. If you've not played on an acoustic kit for a while, it might be a good idea to try and jump on one and just see what it really sounds like on an acoustic drum to hit all of those different levels of dynamics. But it's not just people who want to go back onto acoustic kits that need to be wary of this. You'll get much more expressiveness out of your eDrums with the properly dialed in settings, even if you plan on never touching an acoustic drum ever again. It will improve your level of control and your musicality, and it can even make eDrum specific features like velocity switching much more controllable, because your dynamic control will be much more finely tuned. Getting this right on the kick drum can be pretty important too. Some styles of music call for big thumping kicks at all times, but generally you want to try and use other settings to accomplish this rather than your sensitivity settings, which very nicely segues into another mistake I see a lot of people make. Something that a lot of people can struggle with is proper use of compression settings, and how this affects both the volume and the dynamics of each pad. Not all modules have pad compression settings, but if you do have these settings and you get them wrong, this can also mess up the feel of the dynamics of your pads. I won't go too deep into how compression works here, there's a lot of tutorials out there if you want to learn, but the basic gist is this. You use compression to squash the dynamic range of your drums, and this usually has the effect of bringing up the sound of your ghost notes, or bringing down the volume of your hardest hits, to make everything fit into a much smaller window. When using compression, you set a threshold for what volume of sound you want to trigger the compressor. You set a ratio to tell it how much to compress by, then the makeup gain is the control that you use to tell it how much gain to add back on to compensate for that volume reduction. The issue that can arise is when you're only using compression on certain drums, and you aren't sure how much makeup gain to apply to rebalance your kit. If you're only using compression on your snare, but you're heavily compressing it and you don't use any makeup gain, your snare will now sound very weak compared to the rest of your kit. Or vice versa, if you apply too much makeup gain to a pad, you might find yourself rebalancing that in the mixer, which wouldn't be necessary if you got the makeup gain right to begin with. You can also run into dynamics issues like with the sensitivity settings if you over-compress a drum. Your lowest velocity strikes might not be affected by the compressor, but the highest velocity strikes are. So then the balance between your ghost notes and your full hits will be completely skewed. The compression in this instance can help bring out your ghost notes in a busy mix, but from a playing perspective it could be giving you an inaccurate representation of your dynamic control. So try and use compression cautiously and with these things in mind. Did I say before that I wasn't going to go into depth on compression? Whoops. So those issues were very module side and playstyle dependent. But there are physical things that people can do with their electronic drums that can lead to bad habits or unsatisfying playing experiences. The most notable of which I would say is setting up your pads too close together. This is a bit of a contentious point because with a lot of the smaller pad kits, you can't actually set them up any further apart. You're given a certain sized rack and playing surfaces and that's what you're working with. And then of course there's also the argument that you should set things up how you're comfortable playing them. And it's an advantage to many people to be able to navigate their kits easily without stretching out very far. And this point does once again apply a lot more to people who want to move back onto acoustic drums from electronic ones. You might find yourself being able to play better on your electronic drums than on an acoustic kit. You don't need to work as hard to get between the components of your drums when they're set up closer together. You won't have worked up the correct level of control or the muscle memory to navigate a larger kit. If you're not looking to return to an acoustic kit, it might not bother you at all. But personally, I'd approach this from the viewpoint that it's better to be able to do it and not need it, than needing to do it but not being able to. And I don't mean that we should all be practicing how to reach to the other side of a room for a cymbal hit just to prove a point. But having the ability to play across surfaces that are a bit further apart will still help improve your maneuverability and your flow across the kit. But if you do have the ability to expand them out a little bit further, I would highly recommend doing so, especially if those pads are very small surfaces. Your accuracy will get a boost too. I'm sure there's many other things that lots of people get wrong with electronic drums, but these are the ones that stood out to me the most. I've seen these countless times across different posts and videos. Are there any other things that you can think of that electronic drummers get wrong? Let me know down in the comments. I'll gladly make a follow-up video to this if I have enough suggestions. Or if you disagree that these are even problems, feel free to let me know that too. If you got anything at all out of this video, please pop a like on it, subscribe if you haven't already, and if you want any tips on using electronic drums live or sound design, check out one of these playlists on the screen. Oh, and I also post to Instagram sometimes between videos, so check me out on there if you want to see any previews of things to come. Enjoy the rest of your day and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!